wanted to do a video that would hopefully help people that are new to rod building figure out some of the things that they can find locally. If you're like me and you live kind of in middle America, there's not a whole lot around locally that is geared towards people who build fishing rods. So most of the stuff I end up having to order online that I use for my rod building. I wanted to share with everybody some things that I found locally that I find real useful. Some rod building supplies that you can source at retail stores near you, grocery stores, craft stores, box stores, where you can find some of these things that you can use in your rod building. I thought it would be helpful to people that are new to rod building to be able to find some things that they can find locally, and maybe you'll see something here, even if you're an experienced rod builder, that would be something useful to you also. I just wanted to preface this video by clarifying that I'm not a rod builder by trade, and I do not build rods for big game like deep sea fishing or anything like that. I'm build mostly freshwater rods for catching fish that are usually about 10 pounds max if you're fishing for larger game fish species, and also if you're looking into getting into rod building as a profession, some of this stuff won't be applicable to those types of things. I get asked a lot about what sort of thread I use for doing my wraps. I've never bought rod wrapping thread. I've always used embroidery thread that's polyester, and I've used mostly Coates and Clark. I really like the tri-lobal polyester. It's very smooth and very clean thread. If you're using threads that are made for embroidery, be sure to check the thread closely and make sure it doesn't have a lot of fuzziness to it. You want very smooth thread. It makes doing the epoxy work a lot easier and your results will look a lot better. I also use some other metallic threads that I find at craft stores and box stores like Walmart. One thing to keep in mind with these machine embroidery threads is that they're pretty thin. It would probably be akin to the size A thread on rod building thread. So if you don't like working with the thin stuff, I wouldn't suggest using this. I would probably go to a size D rod building thread or something along those lines, because the thinner thread is harder to work with, especially if you're new to rod building. But as cheap as it is, if you wanted to pick up a roll just to try it out and see if you can wrap with it, that would be something to look at possibly doing also. Some threads that are made for sewing use a silicone coating on it that the epoxy will not stick to. I haven't run across any of that thread yet, but it's just something to be mindful of. If you pick up a thread and you're having problems with your epoxy finish not sticking to the thread, that could possibly be why. Now I want to talk a little bit about adhesives and some kind of alternative finishes for wraps that you don't normally see people use. Titebond 3 is a waterproof wood glue, and it's really good for gluing cork to cork. I wouldn't use it to try to glue the cork to the rod blank itself, but if you're making up grips and you want to glue cork to cork, Titebond 3 is a really good choice for that. You can find that at most home improvement and hardware stores. Mod Podge is a water-based glue type of a substance. It's almost like watered down Elmer's glue. I don't know if that's actually what it is or not, but that's what it reminds me of. But it's really thin, and I use that for color protectant on my wraps if I want to use color protectant. You can find that at most Walmart's, super centers in the craft section, or just about any craft store. Hot melt glue sticks are handy if you need an adhesive to temporarily attach something. You can use it to hold a guide onto a blank until you get it wrapped with thread. The easiest way to do that is to heat the guide foot and just run it over the glue stick to get a little on it. The heated foot will melt the glue stick, and then you can just attach it. That way you're not having to mess with a glue gun. Clear fingernail polish is a type of lacquer that you can use as a rod finish if you need to. It works really well for temporary fixes, but it could also be used as a permanent finish for a wrap. You might find it useful if your clear nail polish is thick to thin it with a solvent of some sort, and it's a little trickier to work with to me than epoxy, but some people might think it's actually easier. Just depends on how good you are with epoxy, I guess. Super glue is not a great adhesive for fishing rods because it is stiff and brittle, and fishing rods need to flex, so it's not a great adhesive. Sometimes it's handy for things that are hard to hold if you just need to temporarily fasten them down. If you wanted to glue a guide on before you start your wraps, you could use it for something like that. You can also use it as a sort of clamp to glue things on like butt caps. Just say you're going to put on a butt cap, you could put a dot of super glue in the middle of it at the bottom to where it could glue to the cork that you're putting it over. Put epoxy around the inside the butt cap in the areas where the super glue was not at. Then the super glue could hold the butt cap on as the epoxy's drying without any kind of clamps or anything. JB Weld epoxy is real handy anytime you need to attach metal to metal. If you got a metal trim piece or a emblem or something you're trying to glue into a butt cap or something like that, JB Weld really works well for those types of things. Slow cure epoxy works really well for gluing real seats. You can use 5-minute epoxy, but to me the slow cure epoxy makes more sense because it stays more flexible due to the slower curing time. The faster cure time epoxies tend to be a little more brittle and less flexible. I picked this particular brand up, the Bob Smith Industries. I picked this stuff up at Hobby Lobby, and it's very inexpensive and it works really well. This is a water-based spar urethane varnish. I've been experimenting with this some on rod wraps and rod blank finishes. I found this, I believe, at Home Depot or Lowe's, and it's really easy to work with. It dries crystal clear. It's very glossy. It looks really nice. The downside to it is that it scratches easily, even when it's fully cured. It's really easy to reapply a thin layer to kind of smooth out those scratches if you need to later without completely redoing everything. I guess that would be a trade-off. To me, the best application for this stuff would be as a finish on ultralight rods. It's very lightweight, it's very thin, it goes on very thin. You can layer it to get a deeper finish. It's easy to remove if you ever need to get it back off. So there's some pluses and minuses to it. I've been experimenting with it for quite a while, probably over the last year and a half or so. There's some things I really like about it, but again, the downside is that it does scratch easily. Depending on how much effort you want to put into your rod after it's completed or not, you might want to just stick with epoxy, but I just thought I'd throw it in there as a possibility, something you might want to try to mess around with and see if you like it for yourself. Heavy duty aluminum foil is real handy to use for spreading epoxy out once you've got it mixed, so it extends the pot life of it some. It's also handy to put down over a table or something where you might be working with adhesive and things to keep it off your table. These are silicone cups that I use for mixing epoxy in, and the reason I use these is because you can let the epoxy dry in the cup and it won't stick to the silicone, so it'll just peel right off. These cups I actually cut out of a silicone cupcake pan, so these were actually the individual round cupcake sections of the silicone pan. Cut these out and they make great mixing cups, and you can get them in different sizes too, which is really handy. They got smaller ones that are made for making like mini muffins or something like that. You can cut those out to have smaller cups. You can find good artist brushes that are handy for some things like applying a whole rod finish, and you can also find disposable ones like the little ones kids use for watercolor and things like that. Those are handy for moving epoxy around on thread wraps. You can find these at art stores or in the craft section of a lot of different stores. These tools are used for working with clay. You can pick these up at hobby shops, hobby stores, anywhere where they sell clay modeling equipment, Michael's, Hobby Lobby. I use the stainless steel ones quite a bit for scooping epoxy and applying epoxy on my rod wraps for moving epoxy around. I have some that are really smooth stainless steel ones that I'll use occasionally for burnishing threads, and you can also find the plastic ones which are less likely to do any damage to your rod blank by scratching it. But both work well, and I do like the stainless steel ones just because they're so easy to clean off if you do get epoxy on them. You can find these popsicle sticks at most hobby stores or in the hobby section of big box stores. They come in really handy and work well for mixing up epoxy. I use toothpicks a lot if I'm trying to apply a glue or an adhesive in a small area and want to use a little bit more precision than putting whole drops on. And I also use these toothpicks for moving epoxy around from one place to another when I'm applying my finish to my rod wraps. I found this really thin masking tape at Hobby Lobby in the clearance section. It comes in handy if you're taping on like micro guides or something really small because it's only a 1/16 of an inch thick. And I also like to buy the blue painter's masking tape that you can find at dollar stores or home improvement stores or just about anywhere. And I like to buy it in 1.5 inch thick rolls. And the reason I like to do that is because I can cut my own thin strips if I want to just by using a pair of of scissors, cutting it across the width of a piece, and as you can see in the picture here, you can cut some pretty thin strips just by using a pair of scissors also. And since I mentioned scissors, I'll just go ahead and tell you that two kinds of scissors I found the most handy to have are a pair of cuticle scissors and some Fisker scissors that I found that have a spring-loaded handle on it. The Fisker scissors have a fairly thin tip section on it, so you can get in close when you're making cuts on things. And the blades are pretty long. I use them a lot for cutting tape, and I also use them occasionally for cutting my thread. The cuticle scissors are nice because they have a curved blade that can let you cut threads pretty close to a rod blank using the curvature of the blades up against the curvature of the blank. On the cuticle scissors, you have to find a good pair. The cheap ones don't work very well, but if you can find a good pair, that should run you somewhere in the neighborhood of between $5 and $10 a pair. Check the tip section. Make sure the blades close tightly against each other and there's not any excess play in the scissors. And I think you'll find them pretty handy too for cutting threads close to the rod blank if you need to do that. You can find a good selection of paint markers and grease pencils that you can use for marking on your blanks, marking and laying out guide positions where you want to put your reel seat. You can mark the spine of the blank itself, or you can use the paint pens for writing down your rod specifications on the rod blank before you epoxy over it, or to just sign your blank. You can find a lot of these types of pens and pencils in the art section of hobby stores like Hobby Lobby or Michael's. Sometimes I like to use a 6-pound monofilament line just to use for pull-through loops. The reason I like to use the mono sometimes is because it's very smooth, so you stand less chance of fraying your thread any as you do your pull-throughs. Single edge razor blades and X-Acto knives are real easy to find at craft stores, places like Walmart, and even home improvement stores. Of course, they're handy to have for cutting thread against the blank, and I occasionally use razor blades for scraping old finish off of rod blanks too. I usually keep emery boards around in case I need to file some burrs off of guide feet. Occasionally after I grind the guide feet down, I leave a burr here or there and I will touch those up with an emery board. So those are easy enough to find where they sell fingernail polish and nail care in just about any store, grocery stores or retail stores that have makeup sections. Coffee filters are handy to have because they're pretty much lint free. The only time you'll tear any fibers out of these is if they're pretty much soaked through and you've been using them to scrub on something. The fibers will start unraveling and getting into things, but as long as they're pretty dry when you start using it and you're not doing a lot of rubbing with it, they really won't leave any lint behind. So I use these a lot to pull excess epoxy off of my guide wraps as I'm doing them. If I get too much epoxy on, I can take a piece of coffee filter and it will absorb the epoxy and help me pull it away from the guide wraps. And coffee filters are also really good for cleaning up things that you don't want to leave dust or lint behind on as you're using them. You can use it to wipe down some of your burnishing tools or to clean out anything you might be putting epoxy in. Because they don't leave any lint behind, that's one less thing you have to worry about as you're going through your rod building process. So that's all I've got for now. I would like to mention that I'm going to pin a comment in the comments section and ask for people to leave their tips on things that they find locally that they use for rod building. So you might want to go down and check that list and see if there's anything there that you haven't thought of or looked at before. And I'm sure that some people will leave some good tips there. So that's it for now. Y'all take care and have a great day.